You want those there or?
Check.
Burning all the way, way down. I see the firework its way across the ceiling. And we can't leave like
Check.
Cinderella story defies a category. Leaves you in a class all by yourself. It's lonely at the top, and this wonder won't stop. You're proving to yourself that you got the shot. Well, say this ain't no time to throw the towel in. Just let the game begin. Let the game begin. Say you're working so hard, trying. Oh Lord, I can't help to make them do and me. Till time runs by low, it's so very hard to go. Well, the clouds just might be dark as sugar for you hit the road. Well, this ain't no time to throw the towel in. Just let the game begin. Let the game begin. to shake your mind, baby, now don't be cool. Put it all together, make your backbone slip. I take you on a 1969 trip, no. Ain't no way to make you stay. It's so scared, think go back. Once when it's in beat, be so happy. So, pity,
I'm not-
He just signaled me from front of house and said he wasn't. So at some point, you're just gonna hit play and yeah, fly with that super. Jordan signal put up front, so thanks.
There's a man with a sign said the end time coming better. Get yourself a right with God. Sing his hand, he can help you out, man. Put the word in when you reach that promised land. Single mother strive and to stay alive and do what you got to do. What am I? She be on every house. What will we do if we knew? You did when we were just kids, singing just as loud as you can, and laugh till you cry and kiss a goodbye to all of your dreams and your plans. Would you hold that you would think that was right, even as it's falling apart? Or would you love, like it's the end of the world? Would you love, like it's the end of the world? And would you love? Like it's the end of the world, would you love? Like it's the end of the world. To your lovers on here, staring deep and standing still, they don't mind.
Good morning, everyone. All right, I hope you all had a wonderful first full day of the conference yesterday and got some coffee this morning and have returned refreshed. I have not had my coffee yet, so I'm mad. So, you know, if you look at me wrong, I might snap. So what I'd like to do first of all is what we always do at this time, which is recognize the generous contributions of our sponsors. We had a wonderful event last night at the President's reception for sponsors and exhibitors. And as we talked about last night, without you, we wouldn't be able to throw this thing. Maybe we would, we could raise our own money, but you know, we raise it from you, so thank you. All right, and I also like to thank our exhibitors. Again, all of your contributions go toward making this wonderful event and also impacting the lives of our learners, of our professionals, and as well as the communities in which we live. Because let me tell you, you'd be surprised how often someone you know, says, yeah, they're really a physicist. And you know, it's a you know, when we walk into a room at home among family and some, I'll tell you even a better story. I got to spend a day with Chadwick Boseman before he died, right? It was the day before Infinity War came out, and he took me to the El Capitan Theater in Los Angeles, where they had played all of the Marvel movies, and they were going to debut Infinity War that day. So he and Winston Scott, you know, the king of the Jabari, were there to introduce Black Panther. And the moment we walk into the theater, we run right into Winston Scott. And Chad says, hey, Winston, Hakeem's an astrophysicist. And he's like, word? And the next, like, he wouldn't leave me alone after that. He just asked me all kinds of questions about the universe. So, you know, what you do to create us is, you know, your support helps to create the next generation. People come here and they're undergraduates and they have no idea whether or not they can do this physics thing. And then they meet us, they see that there's others like them, they see that there's support, and they learn the real nuts and bolts of how to go about doing this career. And so your support, your generous support, is what makes that all happen. So thank you very, very much. Now I have to look again at my order. It's from Willie Rockford. So that was supposed to take to 8:07. We are perfectly on time. And by the way, we have 43 exhibitors, so that is wonderful. At this time, is our student representative in the audience? Not our student representative, not in the audience. So what I'm going to do is at 8:10, our keynote speaker is going to come on. So let me go into my introduction of our keynote speaker. I'm really excited. As president, I get to invite speakers. So I invited Dr. Damian Rouson. I ran into this gentleman when I first arrived at Stanford University in 1991. We had a gathering of graduate students, and at this time, affirmative action was being dismantled all around California. And this gathering was to discuss that, right? It was a couple of Black faculty, Black graduate students, and we were discussing affirmative action. And the way that the conversation is going, everyone was saying, oh, look at all the merits to affirmative action. Look at all the merits to affirmative action. Why are they doing this? And, you know, we had all heard those merits. And, you know, this is a political thing. It's not about merit. And so I thought, you know, maybe that's not the right way to look at it. So I raised my hand and I asked, well, look, here we are. We're supposedly like the top intellectuals of the Black community. Maybe instead of having this discussion, because this case is already lost, maybe we should discuss what we can do to make sure we no longer need affirmative action, right? What can we do to change the society so that it's no longer necessary? And there was a pause, and then the conversation continued as if I had said nothing, all right? And what happened is after we broke, Damian Rouson and a young woman walked up to me and they said, brother, before you showed up on campus, we were the ones who were saying this Afrocentric stuff and nobody wanted to hear it. And when you showed up, you were so well-spoken, we wanted to hear how they were going to respond to you. And just like with us, crickets. So don't be frustrated, we're here for you. And then I show up at the basketball court and there he is again, kicking butt on the basketball court. And I began to talk to this brother and I got to know him incredibly well. And many years later, in 2013, I was doing research at Berkeley and he invited me to his home and he told me about his entrepreneurial activities. And I thought to myself, I'm not doing this right. At the time, by the way, he had quit his job as a leader at a national lab. And in his entrepreneurial endeavors, he would work 2 weeks a year and make his salary. So, okay, I thought that was funny. You guys, all right, I'm the only goofy one. So, all right, so I will now read his bio and I'm gonna read it in its entirety because, you know, we need our accolades. So Damian Rouson leads the Computer Languages and Systems Software Group at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. He holds a BS from Howard University, woohoo, MS and PhD degrees from Stanford University, and a professional engineer license in the state of California, and all of his degrees are in mechanical engineering. His early career was in consulting, initially at the Silicon Valley firm, Exponent Incorporated, and later independently, Dr. Rouson investigated and provided expert testimony on fires, explosions, carbon monoxide poisonings, atmospheric pollution, and automotive and aircraft accidents. He later taught and conducted research in mechanical and aerospace engineering and computer science. He has held faculty and staff positions at the City University of New York, the University of Maryland, the University of Cyprus, the University of Bergen, and Stanford University. He was the head of the combustion modeling and scaling section of the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory and the manager of the reacting flow and research department of Sandia National Labs. His research focused initially on simulating turbulent flows in multi-phase quantum and magnetohydrodynamic media. The heck is wrong with this man? There she is. All right. Like I did MHD and people are like, are you crazy? And, you know, doing MHD in turbulence, you're just a, you know, you're just a glutton for punishment. So Dr. Rouson was the lead author on the textbook, Scientific Software Design, The Object-Oriented Way, published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. And he has taught related graduate courses and short courses at over 35 conferences, university, and government labs. He founded the for-profit company, Archaeologic Incorporated, and the not-for-profit Sorcery Institute. So without further ado, I'd like to bring to the stage the brilliant, the professional, and my good friend, Dr. Damian Rouson.
Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it. Okay. Thanks for the great introduction. I hope I can live up to it. So the title of my talk, Where is Everybody? Many of you might recognize that phrase from the past of astronomy, and we'll see how it relates to diversity and inclusion in this talk. So this talk is really about workforce diversity, workforce development. And I'm used to giving talks about my research. And so I thought it would be useful to organize it in the same way that we would a science talk, right? Background motivations, data analysis, discussion of results, conclusions. And yet it's going to be a very different talk from most science talks. But I kind of wanted to make the point that we need to start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in more quantitative and analytical ways. To get back to what Hakeem said yesterday, data settles arguments. This talk started off as just 4 slides in my job interview talk at Berkeley Lab in January 2021. I had some history with the lab that I wanted to talk about. And I guess, as they said in the play Hamilton, I wasn't throwing away my shot. The way I looked at it, this was the one time that they had to sit down and listen to me for an hour. And I had a few things I wanted to share, not just on the science, but on the workforce diversity issues. Then February of this year, I was asked to give a Black History Month talk at the lab. And as part of talking about my history, I decided to go into this story. And so that's when this was first developed into a full talk. My history with the lab started in 2005 when an African-American scientist at the lab, Tony Drummond, invited me to give a talk. And I took some interest in the lab, seemed like a great place. So I eventually applied for a job there. In 2012, I interviewed to be the deputy director of the Computational Research Division. Didn't get that position, but for some very understandable reasons, the director knew that I wanted to continue doing research in addition to being in an administrative role, but this really was purely an administrative position. As I said in my research statement for my current job, the very first sentence was, I live to code. So I'm definitely consider myself a people person. I like managing people. I like leadership. But if I ever had to choose between the technical work and the management, I would choose the technical work. And so it wasn't really quite the right position. But the director at the time, Horst Simon, is a very famous computer scientist. He's the only person in history to have won the Gordon Bell Award twice. This is the top award in supercomputing. Very nice person, took an interest in me. And every time I would see him at a conference after that, he would reach out to anyone within arm's reach and say, do you know Damian Rouson? So he connected me with other people at the lab. In 2013, a job ad came out for a position as a group leader, same level that I am now. And on the day the job ad came out, I got an email from the department head who would be hiring the group leader, 2 scientists in the department. I knew that the department head had sent me the email because his division director had asked him to, and I knew the division director had done so because the deputy lab director had asked him to, because the person I interviewed with originally had moved up to deputy lab director. I don't know if any of the 3 people that emailed me knew that the others were emailing me. I figured I was a shoo-in. Interviewed for the job, felt really confident, didn't get it. Honestly, when I saw who they picked, I was like, oh, I would have picked him over me too. It's Berkeley, it's a very competitive place. Even when a first level leadership position comes out, really talented people apply. This guy was 10 years ahead of me in his career. He'd already been in leadership positions at Department of Energy headquarters. He'd been at other national laboratories. So it made sense. But then somewhere between, over the next 6 years or so, I heard that Tony Drummond retired. This is the person who originally invited me. And it was a bit odd because we're about the same age. This was about 5 or 6 years back. So he was around 50, a little bit young to retire. And I wasn't able to catch up with him to find out what was going on. But on reflecting on it, I remembered a conversation I'd had with him a few years prior where I said, do you know any other Black scientists at the lab? And he said, only students and postdocs, nobody in what we call a career position. And I put two and two together and thought, well, wait a minute. Tony was there for quite a while, most of his career. If he didn't know anybody, there might not be anybody. And it just so happened at the time I reached out to the chief operating officer, who I happen to know from my work at Sandia National Labs prior. And I said, hey, Glenn, are you sure you guys have any Black scientists there? The HR director reported to him, so he was able to check this. The HR director went into the database and verified that there were no Black staff scientists at the entire laboratory at the time. Okay. So you can see why when I gave my job talk in 2021, I wasn't throwing away my shot. My talk was on my technical work, why Fortran persists. But as I mentioned, that's when I started to develop the ideas that you'll see on diversity and inclusion. To give a little motivation for what I want to cover, in April, the Biden-Harris administration released or announced a whole of government effort aimed at generating disaggregated statistical estimates to characterize experiences of underserved groups using survey data. So let's talk a little bit about what they mean by that, disaggregated data. This is from the workforce diversity page at the lab. And I was excited when I first got to the lab and they had this acronym, inclusion, diversity, equity, accountability. It was the first time I had seen that word accountability there, right? But when I look at the web page, I see groupings like underrepresented minorities. That includes Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans. Other people of color, that includes Asians and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I can't count the Black people here. Thinking about the word accountability, one of the root words for accountability is count. One way to say Black Lives Matter is to say Black lives count. But if Black lives count, we need to be able to count Black lives. And we can't do that with this data. Fortunately, there's a web page that summarizes the workforce demographics from 16 of the 17 Department of Energy national laboratories. Just to give you one example, Argonne does disaggregate their data according to race. They don't aggregate us into the groupings that you saw on the Berkeley Lab website. In fact, in Argonne's data, I'm not showing it here, but you can even get intersectional information. You can find out what percentage of Black women there are, for example, right? And going through these links, I was able to find that 6 of the 16 national labs disaggregate their data according to race. That was more than I expected, which is actually encouraging, but we got to work on the other 10, including mine. When people talk about diversity, they oftentimes jump to the pipeline. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a cult when I hear people repeat the same things over and over, these mantras, and it's like you bring up diversity and they say, oh yeah, we know we got to work on the pipeline. How come nobody ever has that conversation with data? Do you know what the percentages are in the pipeline? Are we matching that? Are we anywhere close? This came out in January 2021, and it has the percentage of African Americans in various STEM fields at the PhD level. The staff scientist at Berkeley Lab is a position that's modeled very much after faculty hiring. You start off as a research scientist. It's a 6-year term limited position. You have to be promoted into staff scientist. That's kind of like getting promoted to associate professor. At that point, you're considered career, so it's kind of like getting tenure. And from there, you can go to senior scientist, which is like becoming a full professor. So that's why I'm focused on PhDs. So at least in that title, which is not the only title. In fact, in some parts of the lab, in my group, it's not the majority. We have about 14 people in my group. There are actually only 2 staff scientists in the group. 3% Black PhDs in math and statistics, 3.4% in computer science, 3.5 in chemistry, 4.2 in engineering. So we've got some data here, got some numbers to work with. So let's think about what's the probability that you could reach 0 with a 3% representation of Black scientists in the pipeline, okay? So you advertise a job, you go to hire, and is this chair in the way of any people over here? No, okay. You advertise a job, you go to hire the first time around, there's a 97% chance that you won't hire a Black scientist. I get it, you know? were not that common, very good chance it won't happen. There's a problem though, which is that if you're going to keep hiring and you've already dropped that 3% out of your calculation because you've already made one hire, you get to the second hire, if you want to argue that these two hires are statistically independent, you've got to multiply those probabilities. So by the time we get down to the second hire, it's only a 97% of 97% chance, about a 94% chance. Let's carry that out a little bit further. By the time you get to 100 hires, there's less than a 5% chance that you wouldn't have picked up one, even in a population where there's only 3% black scientists getting PhDs. By the time you get to 200 hires, 0.2% chance. By the time you get out to about 300 hires, which I think we have roughly that many, if not more, staff scientists at the lab, the odds against reaching zero, the odds against not having hired one are astronomical. This doesn't happen by random chance, right? I think that's an important realization. If it doesn't happen randomly, guess what? It happens deterministically. Maybe that's the good news. If it's deterministic, that means we can do things to impact it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So since the odds against what we actually see in the population at the lab, or we did, fortunately now I can, since I gave the Black History Month talk, a couple of people reached out to me and introduced me to other Black staff scientists. I can count 3 so far, although I can't get an official number because it's not in the data that they put online. So since the odds against reaching zero are astronomical, let's take some inspiration from astronomy. Back around 1950, Enrico Fermi, Nobel laureate in physics, was talking with some other physicists casually over lunch. And the basic conversation was around, if the evolution of life is inevitable, given certain conditions, giving a habitable planet, where is everybody? How come we don't detect other life forms, right? In, I think, 1961, Frank Drake, a physicist who just passed away very recently, within the last 2 months or so, I was fortunate enough to see him give a talk about 15 years back when I had a NASA summer faculty fellowship at NASA Ames in California. And he developed this equation to try and bring some quantitative measures to the discussion of how many civilizations should we be able to detect. It's usually written a little bit differently, and you'll see on the next slide why I like to group these terms in parentheses. When I first saw this, it was a little bit confusing to me. I wasn't sure why there was a rate term in there, the average rate of star formation. Eventually, I realized that he must have been thinking about, in computing, what we'd call a pipeline, where you've got, stars coming into existence on one end, stars going, dying on another end. And once you reach a steady state with the pipeline, you can multiply that by the length of time for which civilizations release a detectable signal to get a rough estimate of how many are in the pipeline at any given time, right? Multiply that by the average number of planets that can support life per star with planets, and then all these fractional terms. The fraction of stars with planets, the fraction of those planets that develop life, fraction of those planets that develop intelligent life or civilizations, and the fraction of civilizations that release detectable signals. So this is all about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I would say that if you're in a search for diversity, then you're in a search for African-American terrestrial intelligence, okay? And we can take those terms and translate them. There's one term that I dropped because I didn't have a good metaphor, a good analogy for it. But you'll see here that I'm grouping a set of terms on the right into what I call the pipeline. This is what characterizes what's out there that we can likely tap into to hire. Average African-American PhD graduation rate, average career length, multiply that by the fraction of graduates in STEM fields. That's the pipeline. But then we have to look at what are the fraction of African-American STEM graduates who apply for our positions? What's the fraction of applicants who match specific technical project or what we call programmatic, which is like bigger areas than a project needs? And what's the fraction of applicants who meet some measure of merit? So what I like about having an equation is it gives us a way to frame the discussion. It tells us what things to talk about. When I first put this up, this was actually my last slide in the job talk. And I said, I'm not going to carry this analysis far enough to give you a number, but I'll tell you that my working hypothesis is that if you do carry this far enough to get a number, you will have a hard time justifying 0. So let's talk about some of these terms and what you can do about them. Actually, before I do that, let me back up and say I had a conversation. I've had several conversations with a friend, Gibor Basri, who's an astronomy professor, so some of you might know him. He's emeritus at Berkeley now, and he was also the founding vice chancellor for equity and inclusion at UC Berkeley for 8 years. And originally I was talking to him about that random calculation, and he's like, yeah, is that the right way to do things? Because, you know, we don't hire randomly, right? So that's what kind of led me to think about the Drake equation. And he said, you know, I'd always thought about doing a calculation like this, but I was concerned that maybe I would be able to justify 0. And he said, because we're looking for 3 sigma people, you know? So if someone's going to say something like that, that's a precise statement. So the first question I have, and I said this in the job talk, is what's the random variable you're talking about, right? Of course, I ask questions like that because I know they can't answer. The second question I have is, where's your data that proves that every person you've hired in the last several years is 3 standard deviations above the mean in that random variable? Of course, I ask that question because I know they can't answer that. The third question I ask is, if you can do both of those things, where's your data that proves that that random variable is predictive of future success in your organization? Because if you can't do all 3 of those things, I'm going to call BS. And that was the end of my job talk. They still hired me. So what can we do about this, right? If it's deterministic, that maybe is the good news. We can control deterministic processes, right? The fraction of African-American STEM graduates who apply for your positions. One thing we need to do is we need to expand beyond our networks. Too much of our hiring happens within our professional networks. Someone advertises a position at the lab, they reach out to their colleagues they know in other labs in academia, spread the word. One of the problems is that our networks are not sufficiently diverse. We need to go where underrepresented populations are overrepresented. That's why Berkeley Lab has a booth here to recruit at the National Society of Black Physicists. The fraction of applicants who match specific technical / project / programmatic needs. When I was at Sandia National Labs under the Obama administration, we had the stimulus funds, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, I think it was. And we used that money to create what we called an early career LDRD. LDRD is laboratory directed research and development. So it's internal money that we don't have to apply to for a sponsor. It actually comes from taxing the sponsored projects. And since we get to manage it, we can make a lot of decisions about it. And so the directors, so it's like 1 level below VP. I was a 1st level manager, so it's 2 levels above me. The directors and the VP at the Livermore site of Sandia got together and said, let's start this 2-year program for hiring. So it was not a postdoc, but these were permanent positions, but we're going to put up the money to give managers the ability to just shoot for the stars, just go out and find the best talent they can find. And I actually didn't realize until afterwards that they had done this with diversity in mind, but not coincidentally, I hired a Black Hispanic woman, rock star PhD, who recently was promoted to distinguished member of technical staff at Sandia, you know, now 10 or 15 years later, and is doing classified national security research, keeping us all safe, basically. This is someone who, when I met her in undergrad, was undocumented. Okay, so I like to tell that story because it really shows what that population can contribute to this country. But the problem is that I was in what Sandia calls the combustion research facility. Her dissertation, I was actually her co-mentor for her PhD at the City College of New York. Her dissertation was on turbulence in superfluid liquid helium. Physicists in the room, I guess you guys probably know, superfluid liquid helium occurs only below about 2.1 Kelvin. Not very much like combustion. And I certainly had some staff who were uncomfortable and wondered if she'd be able to make it. She is an absolute star. She's doing spectacularly there. So it is true that when we have to hire for a specific project, which happens a lot in the national labs, the odds of someone who's only 3% of the population also being in this narrow discipline that we're looking for does tend to be small. And also, these disciplines aren't necessarily happening to the same degree everywhere. Not every university has the same specialties. My work now is in high performance computing. I've had some conversations recently with a professor at Howard about trying to form some connections between Howard and the lab. Right now, there aren't any professors at Howard doing high performance computing. High performance computing is an old traditional discipline. They're all charging into AI, quantum computing, things like that. So if we've got clustering of a population in a certain university, but the field that we need isn't in that university, right? Then that's a problem. So we've got to be able to broaden our horizons in terms of who we're looking for. The fraction of applicants who meet some measure of merit, well, the first thing I'd say is diversity improves science. And I will say that, again, quantitatively, because data settle arguments. When I gave this Black History Month talk, I reached out to Hakeem and I was talking to him about it. And he mentioned an article to me that Keith Jackson, who I met for the first time at this conference, I've known about him for many years because he was a professor of electrical engineering at Howard when I was there in mechanical engineering. And he also got his PhD at Stanford, and he also worked at Berkeley Lab. So we have 3 institutions in common. And I asked Hakeem to send me this article. And lo and behold, when Keith was at Berkeley Lab 20 years ago, in 2002, he was saying the same thing. So this is what I'm saying here is old news. I've never given a talk in a venue quite so large, and I didn't realize, like how small the font would be for people. So I'm going to make the faux pas, I guess, of actually reading the slide because I think he says it perfectly. There's also a problem with senior lab personnel somehow equating K-12 science outreach efforts with diversity efforts. I get so frustrated when we talk about diversity hiring and people jump to K-12. The K-12 is who we're trying to get into the pipeline. I would love to just get the lab to match the pipeline. The labs will bring in high school children for a day of show and tell, but will not invite serious scientists to serve on review panels and policy boards. The idea is that exposure to science will somehow stimulate these students to major in science when they enter college. However, a student of color might quickly come to the conclusion, seeing no people of color in scientific leadership roles, that there are in fact no opportunities to take advantage of, and that science is not a viable career path. A student will see it is not a pipeline issue, but more of a spigot issue. The lab won't open the spigot to hire a person of color. I was shocked to find out that this is old news. Somebody was saying the same thing 20 years ago at the same lab. So let's look at a real pipeline problem. Okay, fortunately, I have an ally, Deb Agarwal, who's a division director of our scientific data division. And she's been engaging with our IDEA office and HR to get more data. Here's some data on the hiring of women. On the left, we have a pie chart for the applicants who meet qualifications. This is an actual designation. As a hiring manager, when the applications come in, there's kind of a staging process. The first thing you do is you mark the ones that meet the qualifications of the ad. If you're not going to at least do a phone screening with one of those, you'll have to explain to HR why. If you're going to, you do the phone screening. If that goes well, you move on to an interview. You select from the interview candidates. So 22% of the applicants who meet qualifications are women. We actually hire at a slightly higher rate, 26%. So that's a pipeline problem. That's saying we're already doing better than the pipeline gives us. If we're going to do even better, well, actually, I'd say, why not double that? Because science will be a lot better with a lot more women in it. So, but if we're going to do even better, we probably have to increase the number in the pipeline. When we look at race, this is not a pipeline problem. It's a leaky pipeline problem. And we need to start talking about it not with adjectives like leaky. We need to start talking about it with verbs like, how are we leaking the pipeline? What are we doing? underrepresented minorities in the meets qualifications pool, 10%. We hire at 8%. And when you first see that, you think, it's only a couple percent, not too bad. But wait a minute, that's a 20% hit. And again, if you're going to say that what we're doing is not statistically correlated with race, then you got to explain this. There could be some good explanations. Maybe there are a handful of sensitive countries, states that sponsor terrorism where we can't hire from. It's only about 6 of those on the planet, though. So I'm not sure that, this group is necessarily, disproportionately from those places. You could come up with some explanations for why it might correlate with something, but we need to do a deeper dive. We need to understand why this is happening. Now, what's really interesting, other people of color, Asian/Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, if you think about what's happening with the case before the Supreme Court right now, they're talking about Harvard and University of North Carolina with affirmative action. And it's this standard approach where they play affirmative action. They basically play underrepresented minorities against Asian Americans and whites, and they say, we're being discriminated against. Well, here's what's interesting. The Asian Americans are taking a hit too. 33% in the meets qualifications pool, only 20% get hired. That is a massive hit. And guess what? The white applicants, 41% meets qualifications, 57% hired. So it's not about playing Blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans against Asian Americans. All of the benefit of those 2 hits is going to the white applicants. So this is not university admissions. I don't know what the data would look like if we could see it at Harvard or the University of North Carolina, but at least from where I sit, the whole discussion we're having around affirmative action is wrongheaded. What are some things we need to do? When we have people in our orbit, we need to capture them. Berkeley Lab has these prestigious named postdoctoral fellowships. If you get one of these fellowships, it means you're the best talent we could find in this area. It's not necessarily governed by specific project needs. I don't know how many of you have read or listened to, I like audiobooks, how many of you read or listened to Hakeem Olshey's autobiography? Show of hands. Not enough. I'm telling you, run, do not walk to the closest bookstore or pull out your iPad, whatever it is you like, your iPhone. You've got to hear this. Take every person in this room, whatever adversity we've faced, sum it up, square it. I'm not sure it would compare to what Hakeem has made it through. And why did he make it through? Because he had so much extra firepower in the tank. They said they want 3 Sigma people. I'm sorry for bragging about you. I'm listening to his autobiography, and he mentioned sometime in grade school having an IQ of 162, I think it was. The average IQ, by definition, is 100. It's normalized that way, and the standard deviation is 15. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of problematic issues around IQ. So I'm not saying that this is, the be all end all of measures of people. But I'm just saying, if you want 3 Sigma people, that's 4 Sigma. How do we let somebody like this come through our lab for 3 years and not hire them into a permanent position? That's another important thing we need to do. Okay, discussion of results. Let me see where I am in time. Good. Again, structuring this like a scientific talk. This is actually not a research topic for me, so these are not all my results. There's maybe, I think towards the end, I've got maybe 1 result of my own research, but it's more about what would be the result from doing more diverse hiring. And I said I wanted to make this argument quantitative. This is a great paper that came out, I think it was in Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2020. Some researchers at Stanford in the School of Education, Computer Science, and Linguistics did a comprehensive study of very nearly all of the PhD dissertations from 1977 to 2015. They used machine learning to do text analysis to look for scientific novelty as measured by bringing two very disparate concepts into contact with each other for the first time. Oftentimes, the best work happens at the boundaries of disciplines. With that measure, they were able to show that people from underrepresented groups produce higher rates of scientific novelty. However, unfortunately, their contributions are devalued and discounted. For example, novel contributions by gender and racial minorities are taken up by other scholars at lower rates than novel contributions by gender and racial majorities. And equally impactful contributions of gender and racial minorities are less likely to result in successful scientific careers than for majority groups. Okay, I know some of this is depressing. I'll try to get to some more good news towards the end. So nobody tried to tell me that we need to play diversity against quality. We will improve science the more different kinds of people we have doing it. The data prove it. Data settle arguments. In the same paper, they've got it quantitatively here. This is for gender. There are similar issues around race. On the x-axis, the percentage of people in the same gender as a given underrepresented group. The more you get people, I'm sorry, the lower your percentage is in the population, and they were doing this on an institution by institution basis. So at a given institution, the smaller you are in that population, smaller your share of the demographic you are, the more likely it is you'll do more novel work. Unfortunately, the larger your share of the population, the more likely that work will have impact. It will be cited and then taken up, and you'll see similar combinations of disparate ideas in subsequent work. Another one of the results of diversity. So I want to talk, so diverse work groups do more innovative work. I would also say that diverse work groups do the work differently. I have a habit of following the Supreme Court pretty closely and oftentimes downloading PDFs of the rulings. They're actually far more readable than you might think. I very much believe in going to original sources. Don't work with just the filter of the news media. And I mean, I've seen at the Supreme Court level, justices, I think it was Scalia, just literally basically ridiculing the notion that it would make any difference if we had more people doing physics from different groups, from, for example, Blacks and Hispanics. But look at this book by Stefan Alexander. My partner, my son, gave me this for Father's Day a few years back. I think it was around 5 years ago when it came out. It's called The Jazz of Physics. When I first saw that title, it seemed backwards to me. I was used to seeing books like The Physics of Jazz, and they would talk about vibrating strings and acoustics and this sort of thing. No, this was The Jazz of Physics. This is about the fact that he's African-American, he's a cosmology professor at Brown, and he's also a jazz musician. And he'll go to jam sessions and sit in a jam session and work through his physics theories, listening to the music and being inspired by the music. And I think for the vast majority of people, when they first hear that, it might sound a little bit hokey, which is why it's great that he's got some quotes in here from two of the top physicists of all time, two Nobel laureates, including Albert Einstein. Someone asked him about his theory of relativity, and he said, "It occurred to me by intuition, and music was the driving force behind that intuition. My discovery was the result of musical perception." Who's going to argue with Albert Einstein? Abdus Salam, another Nobel laureate in physics, was talking to Jim Gates, who's a Black physicist, back, I think, when Jim was in grad school. I think this was probably in like the early 80s. And Jim relayed that to Stefan, and he said, out of the blue, Salam says to Jim, "One day when your people do jazz, it will be like physics. When your people do physics, it will be like jazz." I think to today's ears that, at least when I first heard it, might sound a little bit patronizing, but in context, it was very much taken as a compliment. I take it as a compliment. He's saying we'll do physics differently when we have different populations doing it. Diverse workforces do more innovative work, they do the work differently, and they do different work. My specialty is Fortran. It's the world's first widely used programming language. Fortran reached 65 this year, reached Medicare age. And the language is constantly evolving and updating. I work on object-oriented parallel functional programming patterns in modern Fortran. But if I think back to the, early in my career, I started a faculty job at the City College of New York in 1999, thinking about writing a code. I was doing computational fluid dynamics, thinking about starting a research group and thinking about what language to use and what programming approaches. And I ended up settling on Fortran at a time when scientists were first really beginning to embrace a broader array of programming paradigms than the traditional way that we wrote codes, which was called procedural programming, where the basic unit of decomposition is a procedure. Starting to think about objects, starting to think about functional programming concepts where you write pure functions that have no side effects. They don't modify their arguments, for example. And again, sorry for the small font here, but this is an article that came out at a workshop in 2020. Lois Kerfman McKinney's mathematician at Argonne National Laboratory interviewed Marianne Leung, who's a chemist who does workforce development, and me. And the article is basically just a transcript of that interview about diversity in computing. And one of the things I was saying is that, around 20 years ago, I see my adopting an underdog language because Fortran, really kind of gets bad mouth. I'll show you that in a second. Outside the dominant culture in STEM fields was largely an extension of my being outside the dominant culture in STEM fields, meaning being a Black engineer, a Black scientist. When most people were adopting other languages, I found that an ability to embrace difference and combat stigma along one obvious dimension, I'll say race, made it more comfortable for me to swim upstream or outside the mainstream along another dimension, programming language choice. In all honesty, is because I didn't think the dominant culture would value my work that much anyway, so why try? I'm gonna do my thing, I was a bit of a rebel. I left academia without even applying for tenure. Unfortunately, 2 of my 3 PhD students left the program a year before I was supposed to go for tenure, so I left the program. And I was kind of thinking about tenure, and I thought, well, it's sort of 2 things. It's job security. Problem is, I was teaching at a public college in Harlem with a PhD from Stanford in mechanical engineering. I was making the least amount of money out of any job I would possibly take. So why would I care about job security? And it's the stamp of approval. It's the respect of your peers. The problem is, I really didn't give 2 hoots what my peers thought of my work. I was doing the work because I found it interesting. I won't have time to go into this, but much later I got a diagnosis of ADHD, and I realized that it was that fact that had dominated so much of my career. It's because I will do things because I'm into them, and I will go all into them and become a leader in the field. Last year I gave the keynote address at the International Fortran Conference. So always been kind of a bit of a rebel and comfortable operating outside of the mainstream. A really important point, and why I'm bringing up Fortran, is that we think of source code, we think of the target of source code as being the computer, but if the target were really the computer, we would just write assembly language all the time. When I was in high school, I was writing hexadecimal machine code because I didn't have the money to buy an assembler and didn't know how to explain to my mom what one was. And so the real reason we write source code in something that's close to English is because we write it to communicate with humans. This is just a 2-pager position paper that I published at a workshop last year on the science of scientific software development. And we were talking about bias in coded language forms. In this case, we were talking about aviation language, which is aviation English, which is a coded form used in the aviation industry, and some issues around certain parts of a competency test being like putting a certain group at a disadvantage, non-native English speakers at a disadvantage, even though that part of the test was shown not to correlate with anything that was really needed in the work. And so it was just our way of showing bias in coded language forms and try to relate that to coding, to programming. So once you recognize that source code is for humans, some of the same biases that we have in spoken languages can creep into programming languages. This is an article that was published in '75. I found it in a course syllabus from 2001 here at UVA. And it's by Edsger Dijkstra, famous computer scientist. And at the bottom, he says, Fortran, the infantile disorder. How does that feel? If your life's work has largely centered around an infantile disorder, you start to get the idea that we can have bias in programming languages as well. You can write Fortran in any language. This is a common way in software engineering to say you can write bad code in any language. Fortunately, I do think we're kind of turning a corner. Last year, there was this article with the headline, Real Programmers Write Java Like Fortran. So I think people are starting to recognize what we can do in Fortran. Fortran is still empowering, still fueling a lot of the world. Every time you look at a weather forecast, you're looking at the results of a Fortran code, guaranteed. 190-something nations signed the Paris Climate Accord. And many of them are now gathered to talk about climate again. They did all of that on the results of Fortran codes and, of course, observations. This is some data from the Supercomputer Center at Lawrence Berkeley, it's the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center, NERSC, showing that as much as many people think the language has died, Fortran is still very much in there. You know, up until about 2014, 2015, it was actually in the lead. They used to originally gather data like this by doing user surveys. Now they actually just look at the runtime, look at libraries that are executing at runtime when the codes are running, so they can get hard data on it. And they're showing that Fortran is neck and neck as recently as 2018. That's the most recent data I have with C++ and ahead of C. So rumors of Fortran's demise are greatly exaggerated. So this term intersectionality, I'm sure many of you, especially the students, have probably heard this term quite a bit. I actually had heard about it for several years before I really understood what it meant. And it wasn't until I was starting to put this kind of talk together that I delved into it. Found out that Kimberly Crenshaw, UCLA School of Law professor, was the one who popularized the term in the 70s. By the way, Google Scholar citation count on this paper that popularized it, 27,000 citations. I've never seen anything within almost within an order of magnitude of that. Talk about impactful work. And it was the idea that when you are at the intersection of two communities that both experience discrimination, there is a special kind of discrimination that can happen at that intersection. She was talking about a law case where a Black woman was suing a company for discrimination. The case was thrown out by the courts. The problem is Black woman is not a protected class. Black is a protected class, but they were hiring a lot of Black folks, but they were mostly in manual labor jobs and they were men. Woman is a protected class, but they were hiring a lot of women, except that they were mostly white in front office jobs. If you're a Black woman at the intersection, you were out of luck. When I first started thinking about this, I was thinking Black Fortran programmer. But actually, much more recently, I realized that's not really the true intersection that has impacted me the most. What's impacted me the most is that I have transitioned into a career in computer science. The lab hires lots of computer scientists. Virtually none of them touch Fortran. The lab hires lots of Fortran programmers. When I was in the combustion research facility, the top codes running on the top machines, 2 of them were in my department, Fortran codes, hugely impactful in their fields, but they don't even talk about their code. They just talk about the combustion results. Try getting a job as a computer scientist specializing in Fortran. Good luck. Last couple things I'll say are, we need to think not just about diversity in terms of protected classes, but also diversity of thought. We need to resist juggernauts. If you're doing parallel computing and you're writing code, there's a greater than 90% chance that you're using the message passing interface, MPI. It's ubiquitous. That is a library that you have to put calls in your language, and just to write hello world, you're looking at about 6 different procedure calls, each having, let's say on average, about 4 arguments. That's a lot of complexity to write hello world. Fortran has a built-in parallel programming model. It's one of a class of models called partition global address space, PGLAS models. That's us down there. That's all PGAS models down there. Fortran, Unified Parallel C, Titanium, UPC++, all these different parallel programming models within that category. Hardly anybody touches it, despite the fact that there are measurable benefits. We call the parallel features in Fortran co-array Fortran, or CAF sometimes for short. On the left, I've got a climate model that I was working with a collaborator, and we're showing that if you write MPI, at least in the traditional way that most scientists write it, your execution times are longer than with co-array Fortran. The co-array Fortran could be supported in a couple different ways. One is this library called SHMEM. Another is with MPI. What's crazy is that even when we're supporting under the hood the co-array Fortran with MPI, we're still getting better performance because we're giving you better MPI than you would have written yourself. On the right is a library that's developed in my group at the lab called GasNet. It's a competitor to MPI. And what we're seeing is that GasNet saturates at the peak bandwidth for the system at a smaller message size than MPI. So better results, but everybody's doing MPI. You know, hire your first black guy, you might be doing Fortran. That's part of the message. A lot of people, I think, tend to think that they'll hire more black and brown folks, but they'll kind of just keep doing the same thing. No, you hire more of us, you'll be doing different science, you'll be doing it differently, and it'll be more innovative. Last, I think I just have 2 slides left here before the conclusions. Keith Jackson in that same article was talking about solutions. We need to bring more people into the workforce and train them. He's talking about summer schools and workshops for undergraduates and graduate students. Once you're an undergraduate or graduate student in a STEM field, you're in the pipeline. So that's what I'm talking about. We need to be working with the pipeline we have. I'm not saying don't do K through 12. I'm saying we're already doing a lot of that. It's going to happen. It'll continue to happen, but this is what's not happening enough. And a specific program that does that is called Sustainable Research Pathways. Won a 2021 award from the HPC Wired Workforce Diversity Inclusion Award. Without going into a lot of detail, it started at Berkeley Lab for 8 years, has now made the jump and is to 7 other labs. And this is a program, if you're interested in computational physics, for example, to think about applying for. It does matchmaking, what I call speed dating for research. They run a workshop that brings the lab staff into contact with faculty and students. If there's a match, there's a funded collaboration that happens the next summer, and hopefully those collaborations grow. I had 3 people working in my group with me specifically last summer through this program. It's great. We're continuing to collaborate. 2 of them, one is an African-American PhD student at San Diego State, not one of the places that Berkeley Lab collaborates with a lot. Two were a professor and a student at Northern New Mexico College. The most important point being, I had never heard of Northern New Mexico College until last summer. Conclusions. Black lives count, so let's count Black lives. Stop aggregating the data. We need to disaggregate. The Biden-Harris administration has called for it. The odds against random sampling resulting in negligible representation are astronomical. Underrepresentation relative to the pipeline happens deterministically and is therefore solvable. That next point I've emphasized several times already. And then programming languages and human languages are human languages. Bias can be intersectional. And award-winning results talking about the award that Sustainable Research Pathways got for their work connecting the lab with a more diverse cohort of collaborators. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, microphone check. All right. Data solves arguments. Thank you for bringing some data to the discussion. We're going to open the floor for questions. We have Morgan running the mic, and I am just here. Oh, and Alan as well. And I'm just here as security in case anybody gets out of line.
I want to do a selfie with you guys.
Hi, I'm Bill Wilson from Harvard University. First, I want to say thank you, because you've now given me the opportunity to call bullshit on a lot of people at Harvard.
Thank you.
And that's going to happen a lot when I go back. So I've actually,
Okay.
one, I would like to poke you to get your slides.
Yes, absolutely. And
But
I really,
took a few pictures, so I think I can build some slides around it.
yes.
But I think this notion that we're not taking advantage of the pipeline we have is an important, powerful argument we have to make,
Right.
and we have to communicate, because
Right.
it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if they try to play it off of quality, point out that we'll get better quality when we have a more diverse population. And I'll promise you I'll get this into a paper soon. I know if you're going to cite this at Harvard, I better give you a paper. Is there a question over there?
Do I have to stand? Hey, I'm Brian Ramson. I'm at Fermilab. So I see you, National Laboratory colleague. I just started as a
Nice.
staff scientist. A lot of these arguments I've made directly to folks at Fermilab.
Excellent.
So I really like the presentation. It's really great.
Thank
But
you.
in thinking deeply about this, what I have found is that there is this argument and it's true, but then there's also like a separate parallel argument that indicts the very structures in which we work. And I wonder if you have any words on that.
Give me an example of the very structures in which we work.
So like the idea that a national laboratory exists indicates that there's some institution that can dedicate resources that could otherwise be going to, the Black
Yeah.
folks, or Black
Sure.
population in general,
Sure.
that would solve the
Yeah.
pipeline problem inherently, right?
Yeah.
Like ultimately these institutions are reflections. I mean, they sit on top of
Yeah.
large injustices that we need to address as well.
Yeah.
So I agree with all this. I am on board with it. I've made the exact same arguments
Sure.
myself.
Yeah.
But for the further iteration of this argument,
Yep.
I guess, have you thought about it, and what can you say about it?
So I've worked in a lot of arenas, consulting firm, academia, government labs. I've been an entrepreneur. And so whenever I drop into some new setting, I kind of look around and I was like, okay, why is this place here? Like, what's our real purpose? And when I first moved to a national lab, one of the things I realized was that they exist to do things at scale. That's why we have supercomputers. That's why we have, cyclotrons, or the advanced light source at Berkeley. We do research. Academia does research. Companies do research. What's the difference? In academia, you have a lot of turnover. Basically, when your employees, your research assistants, become the most productive, they graduate and leave, right? In companies, they've got the profit motive driving everything. So we need a place where we can put the mission, some big mission like energy, climate, in front of people, and we can give them the consistency to be able to work on it, for many of them for their whole careers, or certainly for long periods of time, on large systems. So that's why the National Lab System exists. What I would say in terms of structures, I also think a lot about rankings and what we do to build up certain places and concentrate the resources in those places. When I was in college in the 80s, when the US News and World Report first started doing their ranking of universities. And, they like to say they have a formula, and this is, in that sense, objective and quantitative. But then recently, a professor at Columbia pointed out that Columbia was fudging their data and they dropped 12 points. So like, what happened to the formula, guys? I thought this was objective. How do you drop 12 points in 1 year? Or let's say you're coming up with the formula for the first time and you apply it. Howard comes out number one, of course, because I went to Howard. Spelman and Morehouse, Xavier, North Carolina A&T. Do you think they're going to stick with that formula? Not a chance. So we construct these hierarchies, and there is an informal way of thinking about the national labs where Berkeley Lab is at the top, which is why it was so hard for me to get there. And we do concentrate resources, in places like that. So I would say we need to call BS on a lot of that too, on the notion that these certain places where we concentrate so much resources are the best, in some one dimension, or even pulling together multiple dimensions, but in one number, a ranking. I hope that addresses some of what you were asking about.
So kind of going back to some of the class dynamics that were mentioned, or economics. Do you think that Black scientists who have gotten their PhD are disproportionately pulled to the private sector to try to make money for their families, as opposed to going to the national lab structures, which focus
Right.
more on the scale projects
Yeah.
and profit? And can you like model that as like maybe like an attractor problem that we would have in
Mhm.
physics or math?
So I was really glad I started my career in consulting. I'm also glad I didn't stay, but at the same time, it taught me what my time was worth, because we billed our time by the hour, and it was worth a lot more than I thought. You know, and 25 years ago, at age, 28, 29, 30, I was billing at like 140, 150 bucks an hour. By the time I stopped doing that kind of consulting, accident investigations, back around 2008, I was billing at like 300 an hour. I had actually left the consulting firm by that point. I learned that, well, that's the thing about consulting firms, is that once you learn how to build a practice, you can build it anywhere. You kind of don't really need the firm. When I moved from there into academia and then government labs, I kept that going on the side. And so I tend to think that, well, I guess I never wanted to have my primary job be my sole, or maybe even my primary source of income. For much of my career, I actually made way more on real estate investing than on my salary. And I wish I had time to talk about that. So I don't think we necessarily need to look at feeling like we're sucked into industry for the money. There's lots of things you can do for the money, even while you're doing something that pays less. And I think that's very liberating.
Hi, thank you very much for such a good presentation. I want to go back to some of your slides on the leaky pipeline, or the pipeline that's leaking. Have you given any thought about the interface between the pipeline and the employment pool? And what are some of the concerns we should deal with as diversity practitioners in addressing those complexities within that interface between the pipeline and the employment pool?
Well, the very first thing that comes to mind, I didn't have time to go much into it, but the last slide, sustainable research pathways. Again, anytime anybody who's doing computing, computational physics, for example, you should think about applying for this program. Unfortunately for this year, the deadline recently passed, but that is building that interface. So my background is in fluid dynamics, turbulence specifically. And what you're doing with stirring the cream in your coffee is that you're increasing the interface between the cream and the coffee. That gives you a lot more area for diffusion. And what would have taken days to diffuse happens in seconds, right? We need programs that increase our interface with a much more diverse population. That's what this kind of program is doing. They aim to support about 200 faculty and students to collaborate with the national labs. And it started in computing because the woman who started it, Marianne Leung, who's a chemist, but her dissertation was on quantum computing. That's why it started in computing, is because she started it. But this should be in all STEM fields, something like this. If we, at Berkeley Lab, we have about 6 major areas, computing only being one of them. So we should have, this program should expand by an order of magnitude if we can stretch it across the lab and not just being in computing. I hope that addresses your question to some extent.
Hi, Eric Hudson, Penn State University. You showed data with the incoming and the outgoing, right? The who's applying
Versus who hired.
versus and who's hired. But there's this intermediate step of offers.
Yeah.
And I wonder, does that data, where does that data lie in there? Because of course it changes
Yes.
how you solve the problem. If it mirrors the outcome, then you just fire the hiring committees and that solves the problem.
Yeah.
If it mirrors the pool, then it means that there's some systemic issues that need to be addressed in order to actually attract people to come into the position.
Yeah, and I wish I had that. I have seen something on that. I think it was interviewed. It wasn't talking about offers. I could say, at least in terms of who was interviewed, it was pretty close to the pipeline. So something happens in that last step. Either it's who we pick or who accepts our offers. And I don't know that piece yet. It's not easy to get this kind of data. It took a division director 2 levels above me months to get that.
All right. Once again, let's thank Dr. Damian Rouson. And I did not pay for him to put my picture in his talk. Thank you, sir. Thank
You're
you, sir.
welcome.
You're always
Thank you.
deeply insightful, and I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
so much. We're going to ask Dr. Carol Scarlett to come to the stage, and she is going to, ma'am. There we go.
So I just have a few housekeeping items. First, if everyone can remember that we have some surveys for the conference, we ask, especially for the students, to participate in those. We need your feedback. We need to collect data too, because that's what solves arguments. The other thing is that for any of you students who have not talked to a judge about your posters, we're still in the process of judging posters. We have 2 more poster sessions. I'm asking that each of you who has not spoken with the judge about your poster, make sure you're at the next 2 poster sessions. We do have awards at the end of the conference for the best posters, and we want to make sure we give everybody ample opportunity to participate. And I believe that there is the last item is photos. There will be some small group photos that will be taken. Do you have any? Out front, yes. So please make sure you participate in those as well. I think that wraps it up for housekeeping.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Scarlett. Thank you again, Dr. Rouson. And then again, in the words of the great Russell Simmons, thank you for coming. God bless you. Good night. We will now return to the Omni and to our other sessions. Thank you.